All right, I think we've hit a steady state of participants, so let us jump in. I will start. My name is Mark Wiener. I'm a faculty member here at Weill Cornell in New York City, and I wanted to start the meeting off today. We'll be discussing the agenda here, and you'll see we have 10 items to cover in 1 hour, but I think we'll have enough time to introduce some of these topics and have a little discussion, but I think a lot of the success of this group is not only what's going to happen at the once-a-month meetings, but what happens between the meetings. And I think there'll be a lot of time to discuss these issues in more depth and communicate some more. But I'm not going to read these here, but you can see all the items we're going to discuss today. Next slide, please. So with me on this informatics team are several people who can introduce themselves, starting with Charles Bailey. Go ahead.
Hey, I'm Charles Bailey. I am a clinical informatician based at Children's in Philadelphia and work in the Data Coordinating Center for PedsNet, as well as the Query Fulfillment Center for PreCoreNet. We will be working with half of the sites here in terms of managing data standardization. Pleased to meet everybody.
Okay, and Alex?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Lamar. I'm the project manager of the PreCoreNet Adult EHR Hub, but I'll be helping really closely with this group and all of our technical milestones and deliverables. So always feel free to reach out if you need anything.
Okay, and Kelly?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Clark. I'm a project manager here at PedsNet, and I'm the one who will be coordinating everything from the CHOP side, as well as my colleague Miranda Higginbotham, who is going to be jumping on this call later on today. So she can introduce herself later on. Nicole, are you there?
Yep, I'm on the line. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Marcazzani. I'm also a research coordinator here at PedsNet, and I'll be assisting with the tracking for the data pipeline related stuff.
Okay, thank you all. And I apologize, I'd love to go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves, but with 68 participants now, I think we would barely get through the introductions before we got into the meat of things. But I'm really looking forward to the communication, again, between meetings where we can really get to know each other better. Next slide, please. And I see already in the text, some folks have asked about whether or not these slides will be available, and yes, they will be available. And indeed, this meeting is going to be recurring. Today is the 4th Monday of February, but we couldn't commit to a 4th Monday schedule. So the future recurrences of this meeting are going to be the 3rd Monday of each month at 4 p.m. We'll be sending around the calendar invite if not already. And what we're going to be doing on this call is really talk about the nuts and bolts of the technical aspects of moving data around and making sure that it's fit for use, and making sure that we understand the various idiosyncrasies of the way the data is structured at your site, and to really try to harmonize data in ways that really hasn't been possible before under the distributed data model. And we're going to be using Confluence as a collaboration space and documentation hub to share code lists, meeting notes, and technical instructions. And this is basically a very dynamic, user-centric website that allows people to update and add material. Unfortunately, it also involves a number of well, we need to know specifically who is going to be accessing Confluence. So we'll be working with you guys just to understand who needs to access Confluence from each of your sites. And that's going to be the mechanism of disseminating information, so we don't have to lose stuff in a load of emails. Next slide, please. For those of you who are new to this Recover initiative, I thought we should start by just defining what Recover is. Recover stands for Researching COVID to Enhance Recovery. And this description of Recover is pulled just from the Recover website, which is recovercovid.org. There were a series of grant announcements in 2021, and the coordinating center cores went to NYU, which is really the big overarching one that's running the clinical science core. Mass General and Sean Murphy was awarded the data resource core. The biorepository core is at Mayo Clinic, and RTI is the administrative core. And then under these coordinating center cores are research groups. And there's adult population awardees, pediatric population awardees, pregnant population awardees, tissue pathology study awardees, and real world data awardees, and that is us. Now we differ from the population awardees because the population awardees are actually actively enrolling patients. And the patients that get enrolled are going to be surveyed to find out their clinical status, their, how they did through their COVID experience, how they've been doing since COVID. And it's real longitudinal data on an ongoing basis. And NYU is coordinating the development of the surveys that are going to be collecting data on all the patients that they enroll. And the data resource core in particular is really managing the data that is being collected through those surveys. Our world in real world data is complementary to that, where we're not actively enrolling patients. We're doing what we do best, which is relying on the EHR data of patients who've had COVID to understand how their clinical status before COVID, plus the nature of their clinical status when they had COVID, predicts their future status with COVID and the extent to which they're affected with post-acute syndrome of post-acute sequelae of COVID and the various clinical features that entails. The next slide. Just to show you the scope of the awardees involved, I've outlined the adult population awardees, the pediatric population awardees, and so on. And we're in the lower right-hand corner here, where you see the real-world data awardees are Children's Hospital, Weill Cornell, and University of Colorado. Children's Hospital and Cornell represent the PCORNet institutions involved in this initiative, while University of Colorado represents N3C's participation in this Recover grant. Next slide, please. And then here is a slide of all of you guys. So you are the 41 sites within PCORNet that are participating in the real world data component of this initiative. And you can see we've kind of divided the sites into blue sites and yellow sites, where the blue sites are from CHOP or are affiliated with CHOP, and then the yellow sites are going to be affiliated and managed by Weill Cornell. Next slide, please. And the data flow is pretty basic. Basically, all 41 sites are going to be taking the COVID data, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a few slides, but the initial data set that you will contribute is basically the data set that you've been using for the CDC queries, for those of you that have been participating in that. And then we're going to ask you, and we'll show you how to upload your data into S3 buckets, which is basically like an SFTP landing site for Amazon. The folks from CHOP and Weill Cornell will take the data that you upload into these buckets and move it into a cloud-based database server. Initially, it's going to be Postgres, but we're expecting to migrate to Redshift in the near future. And then once all the data is in the database, we'll be able to analyze it in different ways to create summary statistics and visualizations, cohort identification and queries and actual science looking at associations between clinical status and therapeutic decisions and important outcomes related to PASC. Next slide, please. So the cohort inclusion criteria is, again, very similar to what the cohort requirements were for the CDC queries. And it's basically anyone with a COVID test, antigen or antibody, regardless of result. Anyone with a COVID specific diagnosis, anyone who's received a COVID vaccine, anyone with a set of respiratory diagnoses after January 1st, 2019. And we realized that the CDC PCORNet criteria was respiratory diagnoses after 2020. However, we realize now, with the benefit of hindsight, that most respiratory diagnoses in 2020 were COVID related, and the flu was not very prominent in 2020. So in order to compare the onset of PASC diagnoses as a function of COVID in comparison with other respiratory diagnoses, we do have to dial back the diagnoses to 2019 to look at a more truly independent set of respiratory diagnoses from COVID. And then there's a new PASC diagnosis code, U09.9, and we realize that most people who get this code ought to have had a positive COVID test or a COVID specific diagnosis, but that may not be the case. So we want to find all diagnoses of this PASC diagnosis code. And then similarly on the pediatric side, there's a code for the multi-system inflammatory syndrome of COVID, which is M35.81. And this code can exist in the absence of COVID, but we realize in most cases it exists with COVID. So we want to make sure that we're including all cases of this code in particular. And then once you identify the cohort of patients who have one of these criteria, we basically need to understand their clinical status. And for some sites, it may be easier to just dump all data on all patients. We're particularly interested in all diagnoses and procedures across all time, because some of the references to coronary artery disease and bypass surgery may be many years old. However, we don't necessarily need all data on all time for labs and vitals and things that might fall into the OBS-GEN and OBS-CLIN data. So we are saying that you can limit those latter tables to those that occur after January 1st, 2017. Again, it's not though required if it's just easier to dump everything. Importantly, the first data dump is due a week from today. And again, to make it easier in case your data doesn't quite align with all of this, we don't want to let the perfect get in the way of the good. So to the extent it's easiest just to load the data you've been using for the CDC data for this first data query, that would be more than acceptable. And then in order to help you adhere to the harmonized guidelines, we will be distributing the full list of inclusion codes, all the LOINC codes for all of the various permutations of antigen and antibody tests, all of the respiratory diagnoses of interest. All of this information will be available in the technical documentation on Confluence. Any questions? All right, let's move on.
Mark, one question, sorry, this is Parsa. Is there any computable phenotype query you can share based on OMAP or any other standard?
That's a good question. What we're basically providing is the specification that can become the substrate for a query of EPIC. But yeah, or really, if to the extent your data is in OMAP or PCORNet format, yeah, we could distribute a query of OMAP or PCORNet data in order to allow you to extract the subset of that that larger data set that we require. That seems very doable.
Yeah, and I think it harmonizes and improves the quality of these aggregates across sites too.
You know, that's a very, very reasonable and a good suggestion. I still anticipate that there will be differences in the way, in the detail in which some of the data is being stored, and we'll have to address that. But yeah, we could create such a formatted query of existing PCORNet and OMOP data. Thank you for that, Parsa.
Hey, Mark, Jim Campbell.
Yes.
I noticed you say all diagnoses, but you're excluding the conditions table, that is problemless data and past medical history, et cetera.
Yeah, no, actually, we did intend for the diagnoses to include diagnoses that are listed in the problem list.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anything else?
Hey, this is Janet from Cincinnati. So I see that the first upload is due in a week. When can we expect to have access to this Confluence site, which will define the inclusion codes?
Alex, can you help me there?
Yeah, so we are providing access based on the primary data uploader survey that I believe your sites should have received. We will be extending at least one person per site, and that should be set up within the next few days. We will be sharing links to that survey if it has not been shared yet, or if you have not heard of it yet, it is in these next steps in these slides, which we'll be distributing after this call.
Any chance that the inclusion codes could also be distributed after the call, just so that we don't, it's due in a week. I just don't want to lose a few days waiting to get access to a Confluence page.
Sure, yeah, we plan to distribute the documentation off of Confluence as well as on Confluence itself. So we will be sure to include those inclusion codes in that documentation.
The other thing I don't want to lose, I know Mark mentioned this, but it was in a number of other things, is that while we can accept data starting next week, we really wanted to make the first round minimal effort. And so everybody here is participating in the CDC COVID project. And as a first round submission, if you just pass along what you use for the CDC COVID project, that's fine. We recognize that it has slightly different inclusion criteria, and we'll adjust to that for the first round.
Thank you, Charlie.
Charles, Alex at MCW. I don't want to derail things, but I may need to follow up with you later about that. Our site actually rebuilds a full CDM on demand for the CDC project, and then their queries run against that. So we don't have a filtered list pre-built. And we can't
Utah is also in the same category. We have an entire full CDM built.
So is Cincinnati.
We do deal with sites who are in that situation as well. And what we have done, again, assuming that your governance allows for this, is that we will, again, to keep the effort down, accept the entire CDM, and then we will run the query that scans for inclusion criteria, winnow the CDM down to the included cohort, and then drop the rest of the patients. Our goal is not to make a lot of extra work for you. So we can either distribute to folks the queries that we're using to identify tested patients, patients with COVID diagnoses, and so on, or you can just send us the set and we will pare it down to what we need, and you don't have to do anything.
This is Mark Fletcher. We're not participating in the CDC query at all. And wouldn't the easiest thing be to send us the PCORNet query code, and then we could run it locally and send the results back?
Yes.
Sure, if folks want to do that locally, that's fine.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yes.
When will that code be circulated?
Yeah, we'll have to do it very quickly. So I think in the next couple of days.
Okay.
All right. All right, next slide, please. So the data transfer process, as I described before, is just loading data into these S3 buckets. And we basically created one bucket for each of the sites. And then we need to distribute the so-called keys to the bucket, and then explain to you how to leverage the so-called command line interface to move the data from your local machines into the bucket. And then for security purposes, we've created these buckets for upload only. So that way, if the keys get into the wrong hands, the most someone could do is view the files. They won't be able to download the data. And then on our end, we take the information that is in the bucket and we ingest it and transform it and load it into this new recovered data enclave, like I described before. And as with many things, the technical documentation on how to move the data into the S3 buckets will be posted on the Confluence page. And at CHOP and at Cornell, we've been using this stuff for a while, and we can certainly demo it and walk through processes with you. There's some software to install that's very akin to SFTP software, and you basically execute a command and the data transferred to the bucket proceeds very, very quickly. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised how fast it runs to transfer files that are several gigabytes large. The next slide, please. And I think here's where we hand over to Charlie to talk.
Sure, thanks a lot, Mark. So this is following up on some of the comments that Mark made. The S3 process is actually going to look very familiar to anybody who's done SFTP transfers. There are a variety of clients available, and we will be happy to walk you through this. The one thing that we wanted to add at the end of the security notes was that we understand that local governance has specific rules occasionally about encryption of data at rest. While it is the case that S3 data are encrypted at rest, if your local governance indicates that you have to encrypt the data before it leaves your control, we are perfectly happy to use public key encryption to super encrypt the data. So if you're a site that needs to do that, please reach out to us on the survey and indicate that that's the case, and we will set up a key pair with you so that you can satisfy the requirements of local governance as well. Okay, why don't we move on to the next slide and dig in a little bit more to some of the details of the transfer. So as I said, we want to try to make this relatively easy to do. Because one of the requirements across Recover is to maximize interoperability, our long-term goal is to meet the folks in other projects, in particular N3C, at the OMOP CDM, but we will take care of a lot of the legwork for that. So what we're asking is that if you have a PecorNet CDM containing your data, that would be great. If you have an OMOP CDM that contains your data because you are participating in a CRN that uses OMOP or N3C or some other network, such as all of us, and the data are sitting there, we are happy to accept that as well. We will take the data in and then we will transform it into the analytic format. Right? If you do already have OMOP data, then please let us know on the survey because that's probably more effective than round tripping your data from OMOP to PecorNet locally and then back at the coordinating center. If that's not something you have set up, we are not asking you to generate an ETL process that will result in a local OMOP CDM. We will take on the work of transforming what comes in through PecorNet into the OMOP CDM, and we'll of course keep track of provenance enough to understand that that's where it came from, and so it will probably operate a little bit differently from data that were extracted directly. Again, our goal is to kind of meet you at the lowest barrier for participation. We'll work back and forth with folks as well to try to adjust mappings across CDMs. I think this is a lot of conversation, but we should also recognize that pretty much everybody here is a member of PecorNet, and so likely has a PCORNet CDM handy. If that's what you have, we're happy to accept it. The discussion of OMOP is basically a target of opportunity. Any questions about data formats?
Will there be a standard OMOP query distributed as well as a standard PCORNet query?
We can certainly do that. Yep.
That might be easier.
Yeah,
Thanks.
we actually have that actually have that ready to go. So we would be happy to distribute that. Okay, next slide, please. In addition to the data itself, we are planning to make use of privacy preserving record linkage for two purposes, right? The first is that we will want to deduplicate the patients across networks, not just within PCORNet, but when we get to places like linking to vaccine registries, in order to make sure that we are not biasing our analyses with a set of patients who are multiply represented. And then the second, Cornell has negotiated a license with Datavant for use of their death registry. So that's a collection of death data that is based both on the Social Security Death Master File and on a commercial obituary data source that provides mortality information. That license includes the ability of us to share data back to you as well. So one of the values we hope to provide is excuse me, added information on patient mortality out of network to you as we hope a small bonus for participating in the network. In order to perform the record linkage, since Recover operates as a network separate from any of the other networks that we may participate in, including PCORNet, it will require us to use Recover specific tokens. Right? So at a minimum, what that means is if everybody from PCORNet recalls, what Datavant does is uses PHI and Assault to generate hashes, and then it super encrypts those hashes with a recipient-specific key. So that key will be different for Recover than it will be for the normal PCORNet CDM. Okay? That does mean a second set of transit tokens need to be created for participation in Recover. We do hope that the barrier for that is not going to be unreasonable. We will have a demo with Datavant to go through exactly what it means in terms of running their link program again and then sending data out.
Sorry, this is Parsa. Normally, Datavant requires a new order form or a new signature to allow creating new tokens. Is this something that we have to go through legally, or is it taken care of?
So we're negotiating the license with Datavant, so sites will not need to separately negotiate licenses, but they will need to update their documentation, and they'll need to get a separate configuration.
I think right now, if you log into the portal, you can see the sites that you're able to send to, and basically through the negotiations we're having with Datavant, basically all of your sites will have an additional send to site added to your portal, and that will be Recover.
Okay, great, thank you.
I see your question, Jim, and I'm actually going to have to punt that to Alex and Mark, who have negotiated the license. The question was whether the death data coming back to the sites will just be date of death, or will it also include the recorded cause of death? I'm going to
yes, it's really only the date of death. To the extent there is cause of death, it's sparsely populated. It's really just, it's basically from the Social Security master death file. I'm not sure cause of death is in there.
Get much else. All right, further on the topic of linking, why don't we go ahead to the next slide? Excuse me. We will also be using fuzzy geocoding as a way to estimate both environmental and social determinants of health. So what we are doing is requesting geocoding down to the census block group level. So that's a few hundred homes in a group. We actually don't want to go to the census block or certainly address level because that will provide more granularity than we need to do most of the linking, and we would like to keep the potential risks of privacy to a minimum. If you have a geocoding mechanism in place, then you are more than welcome to use it. You use the site, your site mechanism. We're not going to mandate a mechanism as long as it gets you to a census block group. But if you don't have a process working, we have had really good success at a number of sites with the DeGauss tool. This is an open source tool, was developed by investigators at Cincinnati Children's. You can find information at degauss.org. There's the start of a recurring theme here. It's Dockerized, so a container is available that you can in-source to your site. So pull into your site, run locally on a Docker engine, and feed address data to. It will return census block group and without ever sending the address data out to an external server. So in that respect, it's unlike a number of the tools that are out there that will contact Google or other street map sites. Right? So the idea here again is not to create a regulatory disclosure of data. It will return those as basic census block groups, which we would then just ask you to move back into the CDM and submit with your data. Okay, on with the parade of extras. Next slide, please. All right. I think one of the bigger issues that we've been discussing back and forth with a number of sites is the use of unstructured data. So the motivation here is that we understand that the manifestations of PASC in many patients are not things that we're very good at capturing in structured utilization data. So people report symptoms like fatigue or brain fog or difficulty performing at work or school and so on. And those are often things that don't have a good footprint. So what we are extending the analyses to do for targeted patients is to conduct feature extraction from notes where we're much more likely to see mention of these kinds of functional symptoms. This is a key component of what we call syndromic PASC, as distinguished from the systemic PASC that is more associated with medical diagnoses like thrombosis or myocarditis or things like that. Again, for notes, we're interested in mention of these syndromes. We're not interested in details about the patient's identity. And so what we're requesting from sites is best effort de-identified notes. Some sites already have a pipeline in place for doing this in a research data warehouse or similar. And if you have a mechanism that you are comfortable using, we would be more than glad for you to use it. If you don't have a pipeline, then we are recommending use of the TIDE pipeline. This is again an open source pipeline. It was developed by investigators at Stanford. It's a 3-step pipeline. So it looks for known PHI about the patient and uses knowledge about the actual patient's, for instance, name or address to scrub that data from text. It uses pattern matching to scrub things that are plausibly addresses or MRNs or similar pieces of data. And then it uses named entity recognition as a way to infer that particular strings may be PHI. Finally, one of the techniques it uses is the so-called hiding in plain sight approach. Redacted text is replaced with the software's best estimate of what that text represented. For instance, if it takes out a name, it will put in another name. The idea there is that if it gets 90% of the names replaced, then the 10% that aren't replaced will be hard to spot. Right? So it's a fairly effective tool. Again, it is containerized, so you can pick up a container and instantiate it locally and feed it the text of notes and information like the patient's actual name and address, and it will go through and produce the de-identified text moving forward. We're asking for the text of notes, and then we're asking for a short list of note metadata. The ID of the patient that the note refers to, the ID of the visit that the note was created on, the ID of the provider who created the note, and the date that the note was written on. So we will forward more detailed specs in a over the Confluence technical documentation, but didn't want to clutter up the slide presentation. The corollary to the what is the who, right? And in particular, because we're using the notes to try to detect syndromic PASC, we are interested only in patients that we expect to be at higher risk of PASC, right? So what we're doing as a first pass, after a lot of discussion with the folks who are running some of the statistical analyses, is limiting our request for notes to patients who have results of SARS-CoV-2 viral testing. Both positive and negative. The positive patients are at risk for PASC. The negative patients, at least in the window around their negative test, are presumably at lower risk and so can serve as controls. Certainly, we would also request these notes for patients who are bringing in a diagnosis of PASC, right, or a diagnosis that is specific to COVID-19. So that's the equivalent of a positive viral test. We have been asked in the future about the option of identifying a set of matched controls for patients who are at either at very high risk for complications of PASC or patients who are identified as likely having PASC by the computable phenotypes that are currently being developed. So our plan for the future will be that once we have that matching algorithm refined enough with the clinical research groups, we'll do the matching here on anonymized or de-identified patients and return to the sites a list of PAT IDs or person IDs for whom we would request notes, and then ask for that to go into your note pipeline. But that's not something that we anticipate having in place the first time out. Again, we want to keep it a little simpler and be able to define the population in a very straightforward way. We've talked to folks about what kinds of notes are likely to have the information of interest. And the focus at this time is on provider notes. So physician, PA, NP, allied health professionals where that's central. We are interested in both the outpatient and inpatient context. So you can see a number of notes listed. We did have conversations with some of our providers caring for kids with PASC, and they did identify telephone notes as a place that are likely to have information about ongoing symptoms. And likewise for telemedicine or patient portal notes. We recognize that not everybody is going to be able to get to all of these note types. So this is not the sort of thing that we expect everybody to sort of leap in and be able to get in a hurry. I will also hasten to add, this is not part of the data request for the month of March. Right? This is the sort of process that we want to have in place by early summer. We're obligated to NIH to have analyses that include these data by the end of the summer. So we think if we can take these data in by early summer, that will give us some time to both perform the feature extraction and to sort of start to dig into what you might imagine is going to be pretty intensive data quality assessment, because we expect there to be a wide range of variation, right? So I've said a ton of things about what is in some ways the most complex part of the data sharing here. Let me stop and ask what kinds of questions folks have about notes.
How many sites are involved in this part of the project? This is not all the sites, correct?
Like 20 of the 40 sites are involved. Not that we would turn down anybody, but we were funded for 20 sites.
And you were asking for people to submit the actual notes themselves, not the NLP extracts of the notes. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Because the analyses are running on such a short timeline, we concluded that we would not be able to stand up a standard NLP pipeline that everybody could replicate. So what we're asking for is the identified note text.
So did I understand correctly that the cohorts of patients we use to extract the notes are different from the cohorts of patients that we are submitting the overall structured data based on a CDM?
Yes, that's true. It will be a subset of the cohort for which you get structured data. We didn't want to request notes on everybody, partly as a matter of volume, but partly because we're unlikely to need that data for everybody. And again, we recognize that this is a higher privacy barrier for a lot of us to cross. And so we want to try to keep it focused.
Understood. Okay, well, with the same token, then it would make sense to also standardize on that query to make sure that everyone does it the same way, and perhaps make it easier to do it for the sites as well.
Yep, and it's nice and easy the first time out because it's just viral testing. So you know, we can certainly get that query. We're hoping, as I said, to shift in year 2 to a process whereby we're not as much asking folks to execute queries as we're sending with each refresh a list of case and control patients.
So Charlie, am I hearing correctly that we would transmit notes data potentially twice, once with the case patients and potentially a second time with identified control patients? Is that it? Or should we anticipate resending notes data every month or on some other recurring basis?
It will be on a recurring basis, but well below a month. So this is, it factors into the last quarter analyses of the first grant year. That's the summer into the early fall. And our plan is to use the results of those to be able to figure out whether going forward we would need to cycle this quarterly or semi-annually. I think the key question there is, what is the likelihood that we will identify a patient as having syndromic PASC solely on the basis of note content? And so that's going to affect the refresh frequency, and it will also affect the amount of matching that we're able to do in advance. To your question, Mark, we're not at a point now where we even know enough about the pipeline to be able to distribute the pipeline and run the procedures locally. I think we would all like to get there. I think the reality is that most of us would be happy to do NLP, and in addition, it's something that is susceptible to containerization. So in the long run, we may be able to get there, but that's not where we are right now.
Okay. Be delayed just because we'll have to work with our IRB and revise things, Noah, because it was not our understanding.
I am actually really happy to see questions coming up about the details of the feature recognition. Just on the basis of time, I won't go into the details, but if you come back from one of the informatics workgroup meetings in the near future, we will actually focus on that for the meeting. So the technical detail will be there, and we'd be happy to discuss that. Okay, let's click ahead to the next slide if we could. You can imagine that there is going to be a lot of data quality work involved. I mean, we've certainly seen a lot in the CDC COVID surveillance effort, and you know, here we're looking for a more complex entity. What we are hoping or planning to do at this point, at least, is to start the data quality testing using the same kind of data curation that PCORNet already runs, right? So again, we can continue the dialogue at future meetings as to whether the most effective way to do that is to discuss with you reports of data quality checks that are data curation that you were running locally, or recognizing that all sites don't run the DC suite routinely on their COVID-19 cohort. We're also prepared to be able to run that at the coordinating center and then discuss results. We do plan to extend the data quality testing in a study-specific fashion as both the computable phenotyping and the risk and outcomes analyses move forward, so that we can target data elements that are going to be key participants in those analyses. This is one of those places we would love input, right? This is a great place to get smart people together and think about how most effectively to do data quality. So this will not just be the topic of another one of these work group meetings, but it will be the topic of an ongoing conversation, and we really would hope that that would be bi-directional. Okay, next slide. I want to round out just by talking a bit about the repository, since we've talked about a variety of different data. So Mark mentioned that the intake to the repository is through S3 buckets that are one-way encrypted, or they are encrypted and they're designed to be one-way valves. The data are going to remain in an AWS virtual private cloud and will stay in those secured systems all the time. At the moment, our governance limits access to the data to the analysts who are tasked with working on the NIH mandated analyses through the coordinating center. The steering committee, which is meeting already, is the body that's charged with governing access to the data overall. So that's the body through which requests for additional studies pass. And that's the opportunity for all of us to participate in the process of identifying and approving additional studies. Our plan will be that if additional studies are approved, we will work with those investigators to stand up systems that have access to the virtual private cloud and perform the analyses in the cloud rather than cutting data sets and transferring them out of the cloud. Now, again, our goal is to maintain not just traceability, but security of the data end to end. The other thing that I want to note about the architecture is the note data is submitted as a separate data stream, and it's going to be stored in a separate place from the structured data. The access there is not going to include folks running outcomes analyses. It's limited to the folks who are doing the NLP. And then as features are extracted from the notes, those features will be projected back into the structured data. So all of the clinical or health service analyses are going to be done on extracted features. We are not at this point planning to support additional NLP for other purposes. Doesn't mean we're not open to it. It just means that we don't think we've had the discussion with all of the folks who are contributing text data yet about what that governance ought to look like and what matches the privacy procedures that are in place at each site. So we don't want to advertise a corpus of notes for COVID-19 related NLP until we've had the opportunity to get together, have those conversations, and be sure that we have a compliant and an acceptable way to do it. Both of those are important points.
Is there, sorry, this is Parsa again.
Sure.
Is there a known process to submit project ideas, or how sites can basically participate in science and access data for research?
Yeah, so there's a known policy for it. It involves the submission of project ideas, kind of Ames level project ideas, to the steering committee for review and acceptance. And then, as I mentioned, standing up virtual systems that investigators can, conduct their analyses on. What is lacking at the moment are the logistics, are the forms to fill out in REDCap and the dates of meetings and that sort of thing. We expect that's going to be coming over this quarter. Right? So we would love for people to submit ideas. Just give us a few more weeks to get the forms in place.
Thank you.
You bet. I think we recognize that this is an uncommon and likely highly valuable resource, and so we don't want to artificially limit the ways it can be used. We just want to make sure that as we expand the ways it can be used, it's transparently, and it gives all of the participants a chance to have a voice in whether or not their data are used in a given analysis. Okay, so why don't we move ahead just to kind of get some more logistical information. That's the end of the explanatory content we have. This gives you an idea of what we see as next steps on the informatics timeline. There is a parallel path that we hope health service researchers from most of your sites are involved in, that are involved, to your point, Parsa, in generating ideas of interest to health systems and to clinicians, and trying to frame those ideas as kind of first wave additions to to the mandated analyses. We will plan in this group, probably not this month, but well, certainly not this month, but probably not in the month of March, but coming soon, to also start having conversations about the ways informaticians might want to approach knowledge discovery and computable phenotyping and similar kind of informatics heavy questions in these data. As Mark mentioned, the S3 buckets are in place and we'll be ready to accept data submissions next week. So we would hope this week that you could relatively soon identify the primary data uploader, and then by the end of this week, give us some more information about site level requirements and data provenance so that we can start working with you. I'm glad we finished with some minutes to spare because we do want to leave some time open for general discussion or general questions.
The informatics design showed sort of an ETL from PecorNet CDM into OMOP Odyssey being done at the coordinating center. Is that ETL something that's available and will be generally shared?
Oh, yes, we will share it. So at the moment it is written and in testing. We'll want to test that on a bunch more sites before we say, hey, this is really solid. But it's available on GitHub, and you know, we can certainly you know, let people have it with the caveat that if you break something, you get to keep the pieces in its current beta state and keep you apprised of its development. Betsy, I see your question in the chat. There are two research work groups. There's one targeting pediatric focused analyses, and there's a separate one targeting adult focused analyses. We would be happy to connect you or anyone from Iowa who wants to participate. I thought I heard somebody else speaking. If you drop a line to either Andrea or Kelly, they'd be more than happy to get folks involved.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm aware of those two. I just thought there was maybe another one that I was missing. Thank you.
Nope, those are they. You bet.
Actually, that's a reminder that we were providing the big picture for the Recover writ large, but yeah, we could have some more structure about the Recover EHR outside of this informatics working group, although a lot of that infrastructure is just taking shape now, so we can be a little more definitive about it in the future.
Regarding the implementation of the computable phenotype that will generate the sort of extract of PecorNet CDM that we would upload to you, does that run, is that available and written sort of in SAS, assuming it's running on a SAS version of the data set and generating a subset of it, or is it implemented at the relational database level and written in SQL?
Good question. Yeah, I was considering it to be written in SQL, but with a little more effort, we could convert it to proc SQL statements in SAS. I mean, that in a way, I mean, that's why we were initially going to just go with providing the specifications, you know, so that you can apply it depending on the context of your data at your organization. But it may take a little longer, but we can, you know, work to put it out in a few different formats.
Is the expected upload going to be SAS binary, SAS data files, or some sort of database or text dump of the tables?
Yeah, I think we're prepared to accept either.
Right, we get the most flexibility from a CSV file, but we can handle either format.
Will the standard query code, either SQL or SAS, be distributed on the Confluence site, and you'll let us know when that's available, I assume?
Yes.
It would be great if the formation of these governance or logistic processes to participate in the science, as well as these pediatric and other groups that you mentioned that are being formed in Confluence, so all of the sites know what are the contact information and where to go if they wanted to participate.
I think that's a great idea, Parsa. We can add that.
Yeah, our pediatric group is anxious to get their hands on this data and participate. So I would like to facilitate that communication so they can participate however we can.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, we're 3 minutes before 5, which is great. And I'd like to thank you all for attending and working with us. And please email Charlie and me in particular with questions that you have, and we'll be as forthcoming as we can, and we'll be distributing a lot more through the Confluence site, as you've heard.
Slides and recording.
I'm sorry?
Where and when on the slides and the recording?
Alex, can you help?
Yes, you'll be distributing the slides on Confluence and we'll be sending them out. And assuming we don't hit any bandwidth problems on uploading the video, we'll be putting that on Confluence. Otherwise, we'll send it separately as a link.
And then one quick question that I have is, you guys keep mentioning a survey. So will that be in the email that goes out as well?
Yes, absolutely. We will be sending that with the slides.
This was very helpful. I really appreciate it, Mark, Charles, all of you. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad to have a chance to talk to everybody.
Yes. We'll appreciate your time and your flexibility in working with us. Looking forward to doing some good science with you guys. All right. Until next time, take care.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, folks.